story for me changes because I then spent a lot of my time since then, mostly in the ABC Islands, Aruba, Curacao, and Bonaire, and only the last 4 or 5 years in the on Saba, St. Martin, and Statia. So it was my work on Aruba and Bonaire on these tern species that eventually led to me working up in these islands. These are all KN terns. This is a KN tern and a flying fish in its mouth. So that's given you some examples of the types of projects that conservation biologists like me will do around the world. And so as I go through the birds of Saba, the reason I gave you some of those specific examples is that some of the issues related to the birds of Saba can be resolved using some of the techniques that I had explained for some of those other projects. So let's first of all generically look at the birds of Saba and make a comparison between Saba and the other 6 Dutch Caribbean islands. And so I've listed them here and I've ordered them in size. And if I've got this, I put it in square kilometers, and if these are not quite right for Saba, please forgive me, but I got this from somewhere else. I hope it's right. And so I've listed them by size of the island, and in this column I put the number of breeding species on each of the islands, and in this column I have the number of sites that are known as IBAs, and IBAs stand for Important Bird Areas. And these are areas that are given a international classification or criteria, which these sites on these individual places fulfill. And then here I've listed some of the species that might be considered key species for each one of those islands. And some of those for Saba are Audubon, Shearwater, tropic birds, trembler, thrashers, etc. And I'll go through some of those in a moment. And here I've listed some of the issues that may occur on each one of those islands. And on Saba I've listed predators and maybe other things as well. Development is a big issue on the ABC Islands, habitat loss in St. Martin, hunting on Statia. But one of the first things that stands out is that Saba has got relatively few breeding birds. And by that I mean resident bird species. And some people are, or can be, a little disappointed as to the number of breeding birds that are here. But you have to remember that the size of the island is really very small. And without going into detailed island biogeography, essentially the smaller the island, as you would expect, the smaller number of species are likely to be found. Although Saba is very fortunate because it does have many different habitat types, even within this small area. The reason why there's only one important bird area on Saba is somewhat misleading, because basically all of Saba is an important bird area, so it's not too bad. But the problem with that is that, and I didn't write the text for Saba, but in the map they've drawn the important bird area as just being around the coast, but in the text they say it includes the center of the island and the very important cloud forest at the top. But there's a mismatch between the map in that article versus the versus the text. So I think that needs some further clarification, because as I'll mention later, the cloud forest on this island is extremely important and certainly very unique. So the IBA, or Important Bird Area for Saba, lists the following species: Audubon shearwater, red-billed tropic bird, bridal quail dove, etc. And the only information it has for Saba is that there are approximately 1,000 individual Audubon shearwaters and between just over 2,000 to 3,000 red-billed tropic birds. I have to tell you really honestly that I do not believe any of these numbers, for a whole variety of reasons. And so I think our knowledge and understanding of what the populations are of these species is at best uncertain, and for these we don't know anything. But I'll explain why I think that in a moment. This is the Audubon shearwater. It's the national bird of Saba. And I want you to notice a few things. First of all, it has a very smooth outline by the head. You'll mostly see them on the water. This is the original painting of Audubon shearwater, painted by John James Audubon in the late 1800s. And this is an Audubon shearwater in its nesting burrows. They only come ashore at night. And part of the reason for that is that their legs are set very well back on their body, so they can't walk around, which means that they're easy prey for any predators that are around. So they only come ashore at night, and you see that this Audubon shearwater has been integrated into the coat of arms of Saba. Well, has it? Here's a slight problem. I want you to look at this bird in particular. And now I want you to look at these three bottom birds. Now, if you look at this bird and compare it with this bird, you'll see that this bird down here has got a big white slash behind its head. In fact, this one has got one as well. And this one has got one as well. It's kind of a white crescent behind the eye. And it's all on these bottom three birds. But if you notice carefully, it's not on these, but it is on the crest of Saba. Something's going on. These are Audubon shearwater, and these are Manx shearwater from Europe. Here they are again. This is the Audubon shearwater found here on Saba, and this is the Manx shearwater from Europe with a very distinctive crest behind the eye. There are also many other differences. If you look at the trailing edge of the wing, you'll see this is very thin, whereas this is very wide. This is a very pointed wing. This is a very rounded wing. The undertail here of the Audubon shearwater is very dark. It's very light here on the Manx shearwater. They are two similar but very different species. And here are the crests of the Saba coat of arms. This is the actual Saba coat of arms with a Manx shearwater, and this is probably what the coat of arms should look like with an Audubon shearwater. So I'm sorry to tell the people of Saba that the bird on your coat of arms is not the bird that is here.
Great.
But as I'm probably one of the only few people that would notice that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. But it is definitely the wrong species on the coat of arms of Saba. Okay, so where do you find this magnificent Audubon shearwater on Saba? This is a Google Earth image. Well, the answer is we don't really know, because no study, to my knowledge, has been conducted on this species. But they do like very steep cliffs because they're unable to walk, so when they leave the cliffs they need to be able to jump out and immediately catch the updraft from the wind. So they like to have very steep cliffs, so they're probably all around this area, but we really don't know. This is a Saba Audubon shearwater. The shearwater is the animal on the left. Greg. And this is very common with shearwaters because very often young birds, which this is one, very often get disorientated when they leave their burrows. The adults leave them alone for several weeks. The young is very fat. It's full of fatty, oily seafood, mostly squid, but also fish. And they basically starve the bird out. And so eventually the bird is forced to leave. But if there are lights in the area, the bird is attracted to the lights. And it's very common to get species, individuals of this and similar species attracted to lights around small villages, small towns, etc. And then you wake up the next morning and someone's got a shearwater in their garden or something. But one of the remarkable things about this species is its sound. And Carol's going to play that for us now. This is an Audubon shearwater. many years ago, when people heard that, they thought it was the devil, and so in some parts of its range, the shearwaters are known as diablotin, or devil bird, because of that devil-like call. Moving on to another species that's found in the area, these are postage stamps from almost every single island around us. And I'm not going to give you time, but a quick observer will notice that there's no stamp for Saba in this list, but they all show the same bird. They all show a species of bird called the blue-headed or Antillean euphonia. And here's a picture of it here. It's a really very beautiful bird. And here's a close-up of it. Here, this is the male, and here is a female. This bird is known by many different names. It's known as the Christmas bird, blue-hooded euphonia, green euphonia, Antillean euphonia, mistletoe bird, and whatever that says in Dutch. Thank you. And this bird is an incredible specialist. It only eats these myrtle berries or mistletoes. And speaking to many people on the island, and many others as well, this bird was last seen on the island in 1952, and this has probably now been extinct, or more correctly titled, extirpated from the island of Saba. So Saba has probably lost this bird, and we did look on one of the tracks the other day to see if we could find these berries, but even those have now gone, probably eaten by sheep. And so if you're interested, on Saturday morning we're going to do a bird hike in an area where there may be some of those berry bushes. This is the St. Crispin's track. Start at the top and work our way down. And if we see or hear the euphonia, this will be the first time it's been seen since 1952. So if you have a sense of adventure and want to help try and find that bird, please join me for a walk on Saturday morning. Probably the bird, though, that the island is best known for is the red-billed tropic bird. Here's two of them. Very beautiful birds, very elegant. And their scientific name is Pantheon aetherius. And for those of you that have forgotten some of your school Greek, I'll help you with it. Pantheon was the child of Helios, the sun god. And I like this bit. I took this from a reference book. Talking about Pantheon, one could see the glint of the sun's rays in his bright yellow hair and feel its warmth in the flash of his eyes. He was so full of life and energy that it was a pleasure to watch him. The second name for Pantheon aetherius means high in the sky. And I think the Greek title for this bird is very apt. It's a very beautiful white ball of activity and energy in the sky. But there are two species of tropic birds on Saba. There's the red-billed and also the white-tailed. And some of the obvious differences are the differences in the bill colour, but also there's some differences in the markings on the back. And although this species is meant to occur here, I've personally never seen one. In fact, I'm not sure I've met anyone that has seen one within recent years, but please correct me if that's wrong. But they're both meant to be here, but I've only seen this one, which is quite common. Well, one of the things we did was to get a group of happy people together. And the idea with these happy people was to try and find out how many tropic birds there are on Saba. Not an easy task. And so we spent some time in the classroom, and then we went out into the field, as good biologists should do. And one of the things that we decided we should do is try and find out not only where they are, but how many there are and how well they were doing, so we could monitor them over time. And these four areas are the areas where tropic birds are mostly found. They're found in other areas as well, but these are probably the four main areas. And so we decided to study these two areas to try and find out when they were most active, so we could then go back and do various studies on them. And this is the only piece of data I'm going to show you. This is along the bottom, the time of day, starting at 6 a.m., ending at 5:40 when it's dark. And then on the vertical axis is the number of individuals. And for those 2 colonies that I just mentioned to you, you can see there's a very dramatic daily pattern. There's a few during the day, but they really peak by a very large amount during the late afternoon. Now, why is this important? The reason why it's important is that if you're going to do population counts, you need to know what time of day to go out and make it. Now, remember I said to you I didn't believe those population counts in the past? Well, the reason for that is those population counts were made at all times of day. They didn't look at the way of the daily pattern of the bird's activity, and unless you know that daily pattern of activity, you can't really make an assessment of the count. The other thing is that all these are counts of individuals, and so you don't know what the relationship is between the numbers of individuals and the numbers of pairs, because unfortunately they hide away in these burrows. And so this was the start of our work, to find out when's the best time to count them, and perhaps when's the best time to go into the colony and start to study them. And that's what we did. So this is an adult tropic bird and its chick. And this is me reaching deep into a hole to try and get one, passing one out back to Saba's principal, who's very carefully holding that bird because it has a very, very, very sharp beak. Here it is. And the insides of its bill are pointed inwards because it feeds on flying fish, sometimes squid, but primarily flying fish. And so it really needs to hold on to that fish and fly back with it to feed its chick. An interesting little sideline for those of you that watch American football, you'll notice all these big, heavy guys have black lines painted underneath their eyes. For whatever reason. They say it's because they want to reduce the amount of glare coming off from their cheeks. Well, the birds are well ahead of them. Most white plumaged seabirds also have a black patch in front of their eye because that actually reduces the glare where they're looking down, looking for fish in the water. And whenever you see a white-coloured seabird, you'll see this black patch in front of the eye to reduce the glare. Well, having caught some birds, the first thing we do is put an individual numbered band on its leg, which is a bit like putting a ring on your finger, very light. We also will measure the eggs, and the reason why we measure the eggs is that the width of the egg is hereditary, and a female will lay the same width of the egg as did her mother and her grandmother before her, etc., etc. Whereas the length of the egg is a measure of the female's condition, how much food she's had, what conditions he's in. So if you know the size of the egg and you can compare that between colonies or between years, it gives you some measure of how well the females are doing. Having measured the egg, we then weigh them. We put them in a bowl of water to see whether they either sink to the bottom or float near the top, or float very clear at the top and actually bounce almost clear of the water. And the reason for that is over time, through incubation, the air changes inside the egg, and so we can tell how old the egg is by how it's floating in the water. So in this case, this egg is going to hatch in probably about 5 days. If it had been down in the bottom, it would probably be about 45 days before it's due to hatch, because their total incubation period is about 45 to 48 days. And if the nest has got a chick in, we'd be measuring and weighing the chick as well. Here's our cute chick. I knew that would get an R. I knew that would get an R. And here's someone very at peace with his cute chick. And we take some other measurements from the chick. We also measure the adults because you're able to sex the adults. The males have a longer head and bill length than the females, so we can sex them. And here I'm looking for parasites, which is very common in seabirds, to see whether it has a very high parasite load or not. But what do we know about the nesting success of this species? Well, very little is the short answer. We do know that of all the nests that we checked in one of those sites, there were no eggs and no chicks that subsequently hatched, and you saw some of them there. None of them, not one, went on to grow up and fly away. Every single nest failed. Now, the reason why I put a question mark here is that we don't know whether that's typical of just that one place, or whether that's going on all around the island at all those places that I mentioned. So we know nesting success is nil, or zero, at one colony, but what we don't know and what we need to know is how it's doing elsewhere around the island. The problem is that if this species, the tropic birds, live up to about 30 years, and so the problem is when you get, if you have what seem like good counts year after year after year, it can be deceiving because they live so long. It can take many, many years before you see the effect of zero productivity of young birds coming back into the population. So we don't know currently what the status of this species is, whether nesting success is really bad in all the colonies that in all the colonies on the island, and for how many years it may have been going on for. And so the concern is that if the nesting success is like we saw in the one colony, the same in all the colonies, and has been taking place year after year, then when those adults eventually start to die off, which is about 25, 27, 28, 30, suddenly we might see a population crash because there are no young birds recruiting to the population. So that's why we need to understand what's going on, see what the problem is, so we can get young birds recruiting into the population. These are not the only seabirds on the island, however. On Green Island, we have a few terns that nest, and Greg and anyone else that's here, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we don't know for sure, 100% sure, which of these different species may be nesting on Green Island. It's probably the sooty tern, this one, or the bridal tern. You see they look very, very similar, but this one has a grey back, whereas this one has a black back. Or it could even be the brown noddies, but potentially, even around the other side of Green Island, any one of these species could be nesting on the island, but that's something that we need to find out about. Other seabirds that you'll see on the island, but that are not nesting, are the magnificent frigate bird, the brown pelican, and the brown booby, although this is a species that will occasionally rest or roost on the island, but not necessarily breed here. Let's go on to some of the land birds, and this is a very beautiful bird called the scaly-naped pigeon. And Carol, I don't know if you can you play the call of that? The scaly. Okay. For those of you from Europe, there is a very similar sounding bird called the wood pigeon. It may remind you of that. This is a pigeon, this is a pair here, male and a female. Its numbers are declining on almost all the islands in the Caribbean, mostly because of habitat loss or habitat change. It's no longer found on Aruba, for example. Its numbers are declining on Curacao and definitely Bonaire, and I believe numbers are also declining here as well. The island is quite well endowed for pigeons or doves, and I'll just simply go through these quickly. This is the white-winged dove, the Zenaida dove. If you see a dove with very obvious white in the wing or white in the tail, that's likely to be the Zenaida dove. The absolutely delightful common ground doves, a small dove about the size of my hand. And maybe we could play the call of that one, Carol, if you can see it. The common ground dove. Okay. And this bird, which nests up the mountain, it likes fairly dry forest, but can also be found up the top of the mountain, is becoming an endangered species in many places in the Caribbean, and I suspect its numbers are also declining here on on Saba, and I think reflecting that, we'll just play a bridal quail dove. I think this bird even sounds depressed. You probably can't hear. Let's stop that because you can't probably hear it as well as I'd like. But if you are walking up the mountain trails and you hear a dove-like call that sounds as though it's very depressed, you're probably hearing the bridal quail dove. Again, the numbers of this individual, I think, are declining in the time that I've been coming here. Okay, some more common birds that you may have seen around the place. The banana quit. I've heard it have many local names, including the yellow breast, the school children were telling me today. These are all banana quits, but just to help you with your birding fun, this is a bird that's just a few weeks old. It's a greenish-brown color on the back, and it has a yellow eye stripe. This is probably 2 months old. It's now starting to go black. Still got some yellow, but some white in the eye stripe. And this is an adult, all black, with a very white eye stripe. And whilst that makes bird watching fun to know whether you're looking at young birds, kind of teenagers and adults, it can also be used by biologists to know what your population's doing. You look at the ratio, for example, between adults and juveniles, and if you did that every year, you'd get some idea of how well they were doing. So although it improves your bird watching, it can also be useful for biology to find out how well the number of young are, or how well they're doing. Actually, let's go back to that. Can you bring up the banana quit for me? This is probably the most common call you'll hear. Sort of a rasping, high-pitched call. Thank you. Another bird that you tend to see only in around here or much lower, and not up in high altitudes, is the very nondescript black-faced grass quit. Very small, very inconspicuous, just a small flash of green or black. As the name implies, feeds almost entirely on grass seeds. And another bird that's quite common. You tend to hear it more than you'll see it. Unfortunately, I don't have a sound recording of it, but these are males on the left. This one's in molt, changing its feathers, and these are females. Quite common, but not often seen. Probably the species that many people will talk about, though, is this one, the Antillean crested hummingbird. These birds, the three through the middle, are all males. And the two on the top left and the bottom right are females. And there's two obvious ways that you can tell those apart when you're bird watching. First of all, and this is a good example, the male has a much longer crest, and you see on the females they have virtually no crest at all. But the really big difference is the females have a pale or almost white breast, whereas the male has a very dark or even black breast. I've put these two particular photographs on because you'll see this one looks like it's a green coloured on the crest, whereas this one looks a blue colour. It's exactly the same species, it's just the way the light reflects on the iridescence of the head. A very common species, but tends to be in lower elevations on Saba. And whereas this bird also tends to be in lower elevations, another hummingbird, much larger, the green-throated carib. This is a chick about 10 days old. This is a chick about 12 days old. Mostly found in lower elevations on Saba. And this is it again, with a very diagnostic blue patch on its lower breast. And this, about the same size, but slightly larger, is the purple-throated carib. The purple-throated carib is mostly seen from middle levels up towards the top, whereas the green-throated is from middle, lower, and down. That's not to say you won't see them in either place, but predominantly the purple-throated is much higher on Saba and the green-throated is much lower. If you don't see the colours, which you can't always see, you notice that the purple-throated has a slightly more curved bill than the green-throated carrot. Now here are some species that I'm concerned about. All of these species are, well, except perhaps this one, but most of these species are on the middle level of the island or up. In particular, the Caribbean Elania, the trembler, and the scaly-breasted thrasher all tend to be on the middle layer and up towards the top of Mount Scenery, whereas this bird, the pearly-eyed thrasher, is virtually everywhere, although not so common higher up. Could you go to the brown trembler? We'll just let you... You'll be glad to know that all the park staff, the marine park staff, foundation staff, joined me on a bird identification course, and so if you have any problems identifying these birds, they will of course know every single one of these calls and be able to recognize them in an instant. They're all really very good. Another bird that tends to be much lower down, the grey kingbird, obviously nests on the island. Quite common, but rarely seen high up on the island. And I think this is the last of the local birds. There are obviously more, but I'm just showing you a selection. These used to be considered, this is a breeding bird on the island. It used to be considered all the same. All the same species, but this is actually a yellow warbler. And you see this one with the russet head is actually a mangrove warbler. They both occur on the island, this one more commonly, but this one can be found, particularly in the lower elevations. And this one is a very common breeding species throughout the Caribbean and particularly up into North America, but they also breed here. But what do we, so that's kind of an introduction to conservation biology, an introduction to some of the birds that we find on Saba. But what do we really know about Saba's birds? Well, the answer is not much. What we do know is that the overall species diversity is typically fairly low. So if people say, well, there aren't many birds here, well, it's a small island. So we wouldn't expect either theoretically or practically to find many bird species on Saba. But now some information about things that we do know. Red-billed tropic birds, probably one of the birds that the island is very famous for, is a globally important population. It's protected under the Bonn Convention because it's a migratory species, and it's probably the main species that led to the designation of the important bird area, the IBA. But as I've indicated earlier on, the numbers of this species are really, at best, uncertain. We really don't know what those numbers are, because the way that they were censused in the past doesn't include many other challenges. We know almost nothing about their productivity. We certainly don't know anything about their population trends. We think, with quite good evidence, that there's a lot of predation on this species while they're in the nesting burrows. But one of the good things about this species is that they are wonderful indicators of marine health. So there's a lot we don't know, but what we do know is that they are a good indicator of marine health. Audubon shearwater, and this is an Audubon shearwater, it's not a Manx shearwater, it's probably